Well, like I told you, next week we're going to end our marriage series with an interview with Ben and Amy. But today we are talking about our last roadblock. So I thought we might take just a minute and kind of review where we've been through this study and look back for a minute at what we've covered. Now, we started this study acknowledging that marriage is hard and the understatement of that, right? And then we talked a little bit about God's purpose for our marriage, that it's not about our happiness, that is not our target and that is not our goal. Our culture tells us that it is, right? We feel like it should be. But Paul Tripp says that the purpose of marriage is to push us to the end of ourselves. Who told you that before you signed up? It's to push us to the end of ourselves in our way and push us toward God and His way. And so then we covered these roadblocks of pride, expectations, our fears in marriage, our past, and how that affects our relationship. And I don't know where you are in your marriage. I don't know how your relationship with your husband is going today. But I do know where you are in your season of life because I've been there. I don't remember much of it other than what we have in pictures. And you may feel that way as well. Because you're in a season of life that is very demanding. It's demanding physically. It's demanding mentally. It's demanding emotionally, partly just because it's constant. Right? You feel that. You feel the constant need of being needed. You can't go to the bathroom by yourself. You can't sleep through the night. You can't sleep in the morning. You can't go to bed early because if you go to bed, then it's tomorrow, right? I know that feeling. I know where you are. I know the season of life that you're in. And it's hard. And you may have tried to deal with some of the issues in your marriage because let's just be real, we all have issues, right? None of us are perfect. None of our husbands are perfect. And so we've got two imperfect people, and it's like when you put us together, it makes us exponentially imperfect. It makes it exponentially harder. And maybe you've tried to deal with some of those issues, and maybe you haven't had much luck. Maybe you feel like you're kind of just running into a brick wall of, I've tried this, it didn't work. I've tried this, and it didn't work. I tried again, and it didn't work. I'm trying everything I can think of, and it's not working. And so after a while, you get to the point of thinking, I don't think I can do this anymore. This just really isn't what I thought it would be. This is a lot harder than I thought it would be. I mean, I'm really not even sure I love him anymore. And so I'll stay for the kids as long as I can, but really I'm just kind of checked out. And we get to a point of deciding this isn't worth it. And you're feeling this way, and then you try to think about implementing some of these things that we've talked about. But you're in that stage that I was talking about of being maxed. And you have nothing left, right? Do you feel that? I mean, am I speaking your language? Or I remember those days of feeling like I expended every ounce of energy. I didn't have any more energy to try to invest in my marriage. And so on one hand, you're drowning in the most demanding season of parenting, and on the other hand, you're coming to bloom, and I'm saying invest in your marriage, and you're like, well, I can't. I'm just done. And so when we feel overwhelmed, sometimes we tend to shut down. Right? And then that leads us to a place of just living in our roadblock for this week, which is just apathy. So I want to talk for a minute about what apathy is. Apathy is characterized by feelings of indifference and a lack of emotion. Feelings of indifference and a lack of emotion. And so being apathetic means that you're no longer motivated. And you might show some of these signs. I want you to just see if you identify with any of these. You lack the effort or energy to do everyday things. You depend on other people to plan your activities. Maybe you depend on your husband to think about date night or time together. Maybe you depend on your friends to reach out to plan something together. You have no desire to learn new things or have new experiences because that takes energy, right? And when you're stuck in that apathetic state, energy is what you don't have. You don't care anymore about your own problems because you're so overwhelmed, you don't see that you can do anything about it, and so you just quit caring. And then you feel no emotion when good or bad things happen. You're locked in this state of just kind of, yeah, whatever. I don't know if any of that resonates with you. Maybe you're in a good place right now in your marriage. But maybe you're in that place right now where you feel like throwing in the towel. And if you're not, it's either because you've worked really hard to not be in that place, or, and I don't want to discourage you when I say this, or you just haven't gotten there yet. But you need to know that those days are coming. But I also want you to know that to an extent, those days are normal. Those days are going to come. If you haven't experienced those days yet, you will, because like my friend Kathy says, marriage is either hard or it's bad. How encouraging is that? Marriage is either hard because you're working at it, or it's bad because you're just letting it spiral and you're not working at it. And so in those times, we can begin questioning whether this is all worth it or not. And here's the thing about apathy. The reason that it's so dangerous is because it happens without you really realizing it. It doesn't sound off the alarm bells. It's not an emergency that arises all of a sudden. It's kind of the situation of boiling the frog, right? You know, you've heard that illustration where you put the frog in cold water and then you gradually raise the temperature and he never realizes it. And so that's what happens in our marriages. It happens slowly. We don't realize it. And without doing anything, all of a sudden we realize that we're in a place we never intended to be and that we never expected to be. And so I want to take a minute and talk about some things that cause us to get to this place of being overwhelmed, of being apathetic, and then we're going to close with just some tiny steps that we can take to combat that in our marriages. So what are some of the things in our lives that contribute to this? And I want to say this is not an exhaustive list, okay? You may have other things in your life that are contributing to your state of feeling overwhelmed. But first, just the day-to-day grind. I remember being in your shoes and my husband coming home and saying, "What'd you do today?" Wrong question, right? And I would say, "I have no idea, but I know I didn't sit down." And so that day-to-day grind is tough. Just the getting the kids up and putting clothes on them or not, and feeding them, and getting everybody to the bathroom, and getting everybody the snack, and getting all the things. It is constant, and before you know it, it's 5 o'clock, and you may not have had lunch, and you probably didn't sit down. And so just that day-to-day grind is exhausting, because the kids are kind of mandatory when they're little. You have to take care of them, right? But time and connection with your husband can sometimes feel optional. Or it can feel like something that you can put off until later. So that day-to-day grind, it wears on us. Stress, whether it is a tragedy that happens in your life, maybe it's a child with special needs, maybe it's a job that your husband has that's really stressful, maybe he lost his job, maybe it's an older child who's really difficult and you're having to manage a lot of extra behavioral things. Maybe it's a kid who's struggling in school. Maybe it's a sudden or a chronic illness that you deal with on top of the day-to-day grind. There are so many things that come into our lives that are extra stressors on top of the day-to-day. And so what that leads to is you being in survival mode. And when we get into survival mode, we have to make choices and we develop habits that we normally wouldn't choose to develop, right? Because we're kind of pushed to the brink. It's either do this a way that I normally wouldn't choose, or I break. And so we begin to develop some bad habits during those times of stress. We're functioning, but we're not thriving. And we're living in this survival mode. And sometimes it's hard to ever get back out of that mode. And then when you and your husband have different stress responses, that makes it even harder, right? You may have a husband who is really glass half full, and he's kind of always saying, things are going to be fine. It's going to be okay. We're going to figure this out. And that's his way of dealing with stress. And you may be the person who says, I see the glass is half empty, and what are we going to do about that? Well, what if this happens? But what if that happens? Well, if we don't do something now, then we're going to have a bigger problem later. And you can only meet each other in your own stress response for so long before you say, I can't become a glass half full person. Like, that doesn't work for me. It just increases my stress. And so you have different stress responses, and so you're constantly missing each other, and it's causing you more stress to try to identify with your husband. It's causing him more stress to try to identify with you in your stress. And so you find yourselves missing each other. And that leads to you just functioning to survive. And you begin to feel more like roommates, maybe, who kind of pass each other in the hallway, accomplish the things that need to happen to take care of the kids, but you're missing connection. And so that's the next thing that can lead us to this place of apathy, is a lack of connection, a lack of intentionally connecting with each other relationally. And sometimes this is just due to a lack of time and energy and the demands of the kids and work and all the things you have going. But sometimes it can be some of these things that we've been talking about that keep us from connecting. It can be our fear of letting our husbands know how we truly feel and what we're truly thinking. It can be our pride that says, I can't admit that I'm struggling to hold everything together. And keeping our true thoughts and our true feelings hidden leads to isolation. It leads to separation rather than closeness and oneness in our marriage. Or maybe you've been trying to connect. Maybe you've been doing everything you can think of, but you're not getting anything in return, and you just feel stuck. Whatever that is, when we have a lack of intentional connection, it just adds to that overwhelm and that desire to say, I can't do this anymore. The last thing is unresolved conflict. I don't know how you handle conflict in your relationship. Some of us like to meet it head on. Let's talk about it. Let's get this all out on the table. Some of us like to, when the rock gets dropped in the water and makes a big splash, we just like to kind of let the ripples settle out, and we go back to doing what we were doing. And so how you handle conflict in your marriage is huge. It's extremely important. We talked about this some in week 1. We talked about how to address conflict in a healthy way. We talked about what it means to let things go, but not avoid things. And so if you missed that, or maybe you're struggling in that area, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to that first week when we talked about pride and forgiveness. Because if you're letting conflict go, either unresolved or only partially resolved, it has a cumulative effect. And it adds up kind of like interest on your credit card bill. If you have a credit card and you ever see the bill, you don't think about that interest that adds to the things that you spent. But then you get the bill at the end of the month, and that interest is significant. It's a significant cost, but it accumulated without you realizing it. And so when you're not dealing with conflict in your marriage and you don't restore your relationship all the way, you just end up on a downward trend to where you get to that point that we were talking about at the beginning. This isn't working. And when you're not dealing well with conflict, and when things get hard, you begin to gravitate towards the easier relationships in your life, right? And so for a lot of us, that's our kids. Sounds kind of crazy to say our kids are an easier relationship, but when we think about personally, when we think about vulnerability, when we think about our ability to control a situation, a lot of times it's a lot easier to react or to relate to our kids, right? Especially when they're younger and they will lay down with you at night and put their little arm around your neck, and you don't have to discuss your deeper feelings and your hurt and your conflict with your kids. And our husbands do the same thing. They gravitate towards easier relationships, whether that's a friend, whether that's a job that they're successful at. And we begin to gravitate towards different things. Now, we could keep going with things that contribute to sort of this overwhelm and this drift in our relationships. Things that lead us to get overwhelmed and worn out. But what do we do when we're in this state? How do we recover if we're stuck in this place in our relationship? Well, first of all, it's crucial that we understand this. We do not drift towards health. We have to fight for it. We don't drift towards health. We have to fight for it. I want you to think about that in a physical sense of health. Do you just automatically lose weight without even trying? Probably not. You have to fight for it. Do you automatically get in shape by just sitting around and thinking about it? No, we have to actually go and do something and fight for that. But again, the problem is you're maxed out. You don't have that energy to go fight. And so today, I don't want to come and lay a bunch of extra things on you. I don't want to add to your load. What I want to try to do for us today is simplify. So I want you to think about your marriage like that bank account. Okay, how many of you reconcile a bank statement or a checkbook? Okay, a few of you still do. How many of you just like pull up the app on your phone and see how much money it says you have? Yeah. When I was in college, I always knew that when I got the phone call from my dad and he said, "Hey, how's your checkbook looking?" I knew the answer was bad. Because the statements went to him, which meant the overdraft notices went to him. And I wasn't very good at keeping up with that little ledger thing in the top half of your checkbook. And so I knew when he called me and said, "How's your bank account looking?" that he had gotten one of those notices. And so what we tend to do in our relationship is we tend to just spend money, right? You can't do that with your bank account. At some point, you have to put some more money in the bank. Now, you may have learned this the hard way too, and my kids are learning. I'm trying to teach them this, that when you look at that number at the top on your app for your bank, you may have some things that haven't actually cleared yet, right? And so you think you have that money, but then something else hits and you have less than you thought. And our marriages are the same way. You can't continue to exist gradually spending the money, if you will, in your relationship. At some point, you've got to deposit into your relationship. And so that's what I want to talk about today, because when we get to this apathetic state, we kind of feel like it's stagnant and then it's static and we can just sort of hang there. But every choice we make either moves us towards a closer relationship or away from it. Every choice. There's no neutral ground where we can just sit here and coast. If you're coasting downhill, eventually that hill is going to end and eventually you stop, right? It's the same in our relationship. And so today I want to kind of take that analogy a little bit further, and I want to talk about some super simple steps that you can take to make deposits into the account of your relationship. Now, we tend to think that we have to make these big deposits. But what I'm telling you is small, consistent steps. It's just like losing weight, right? I don't go in and say, I'm going to lose 50 pounds this week. It's 1 pound at a time. And so I want to just really quickly talk about 5 sort of $1 deposits that you can make into the account of your marriage, okay? The first deposit is deciding to do one thing. The first step in anything is you've got to decide you want to do it. And so the way out of that apathetic state is to decide I'm going to take a small step. Whether I feel like it, whether I want to or not, I want the end result, and so I'm going to take a small step towards that result, and I'm going to do something in my marriage. Again, we want to wait until we feel like we can make a meaningful deposit. I don't want to run to the bank and deposit a dollar bill. I want to wait until I have $100, and then I'm going to make a trip to the bank. And so in our relationship, we tend to miss out on those little $1 deposits because we think, oh, well, we need to go away for the weekend. We'll do it then. We'll connect then. We'll resolve our conflict then. Oh, well, we need to go out for a date night. And what I want you to hear, I've told you this before, this is like my life motto, a good something is better than a perfect nothing. And so we spend all this time in our head thinking if we could just get away for the weekend, but, oh, we've got 3 little kids and we don't have anybody to keep them and we never can get away for the weekend. Maybe you can sit down for 10 minutes. What I want you to hear is don't wait until you feel like you can make a big, meaningful deposit. Make a $1 deposit. Decide that you're going to do that. Decide that you're going to change your approach and you're going to begin making small deposits consistently in your marriage. The second small thing you can do, you can pray for your marriage every day in one sentence. I'm not asking you to spend 20 minutes. I mean, you can. But you can also spend 1 minute. You can use one sentence. Maybe you're in that position of being stuck where you feel like you've tried everything. And you can just say, God, would you step in here? I've tried everything my way. I need you to step into this situation. Maybe you don't feel like investing in your marriage. You can ask God to give you the desire to even want to invest in your marriage. But you can use one sentence. Pray for your emotions to follow your actions That as you take a step towards your husband, that you would feel a love towards him. The third thing is focus on being thankful for just one thing. So many times we get focused on the negative aspects of our relationship, on the things that our husbands are doing wrong or the things that they aren't doing. And I want to challenge and encourage you to stop and find one positive. Find one positive. Maybe it's something that your husband does for your family that you've kind of forgotten he even does. Maybe it's working in the yard. Maybe it's the fact that he goes to work and works for your family and brings home a paycheck. Maybe it's the fact that he helps out with the kids at night, something that you've just begun to expect as his duty. Maybe you can think of one thing about his character that's a positive that you can begin to set your mind on. Because we talked about when you're focused on those negative things about your husband and your marriage, that's all you begin to see. And so you're focusing on the worst version of your husband, right? He's maybe focused on the worst version of you. So how do we begin to see those positives? How do we begin to set our mind on those things? Ashley and Dino Petrone in their book, Designed to Last, say this: you can usually change the entire dynamic of your marriage by focusing on what you most cherish about your spouse and giving voice to it. Sometimes it's hard. You may be in that place where you're like, I got nothing. I can't think of anything. Go back to that one sentence prayer and say, God, show me. What is one thing I can focus on? What is one thing I can speak to my husband that I appreciate about him? And begin doing that. Number 4, engage with your husband in one simple way. Again, I'm not asking you to go away for the weekend. I'm not asking you to even go out on a date for a whole evening. I'm asking you to maybe sit by him on the couch while you're watching TV. Load the kids in the stroller or put them on their bikes and go for a 10-minute walk around the neighborhood and ask him how his day was. Text him during the day and just say, hey, I hope you're having a good day. $1 deposits, guys. Little bitty things. They add up and they make a difference. Think of a way that you can engage in one simple way. The last thing I want to encourage you to do is to do one thing to repair conflict in your relationship. And this is where we have to be willing to both ask for forgiveness and to extend forgiveness. We have to address the conflict in our marriage. Tim Keller says that essential to marriage is the ability to forgive and to repent. That it's essential to a good marriage. And this requires being willing to give up control. I want to talk to you about what I mean by that. If you think back to week 1 when we talked about pride, we talked about forgiveness and how it is a vertical commitment, right? It's a commitment to God. It's committing to trust him with the situation that you're in, to trust him with the hurt that's been caused, to trust him with bringing justice to the situation, to the wrongs that have been done. And then it's a horizontal transaction between you and your husband. And so because you've trusted God with all of those things, you're able to forgive your husband because you no longer have to control that situation. You no longer have to say, I can't forgive you because I need you to feel the revenge of this situation. I need to pay you back because you've given that to God. You're no longer withholding forgiveness because of the hurt that you've experienced, because you've taken that hurt to God. And so you no longer have to control the situation. But what that means is it means letting go of the outcome of that situation and trusting God with that outcome. And so we have to be willing to do that. We have to ask ourselves, am I willing to do that? Am I willing to let go of controlling the situation and trusting God with the outcome? If you're stuck in your marriage, are you willing to give God control of that and trust Him with the outcome? This is hard, guys. I'm not saying this is easy. But this is God's plan. Remember, this is His way because it pushes us to the end of ourselves, right? And that's the whole point of our marriage, is to better reflect God, to better reflect the message of the gospel. And when we allow God to have His way in the hard situations in our lives and in our marriages, then we begin to reflect His character, His love, His patience, His selflessness, and His kindness. I love what Tim Keller says about marriage. He says, marriage is painful and wonderful because it reflects the gospel that is both painful and wonderful at once. And I think we forget that. We want to think that marriage is wonderful, but we forget that it is also painful because it's refining us. Marriage is not always love and happiness, right? It's about our holiness, and it takes work. It's not cheap. It's not free. It's not easy, and I think it's easy for us to forget that. And so when our target drifts from holiness back to our happiness, which it inevitably does, and we have to keep reorienting, then we begin to base the success of our marriage on our feelings. And when we don't feel happy, we come to the conclusion that our marriage maybe has run its course, that it's over, that we've fallen out of love, and it's just time to move on. Or we think maybe we've just married the wrong person and we should try again. But what I want you to hear today is that just because you hit a season that feels hard and dry doesn't mean that it's the end. I need you to know that if you haven't gotten there, you're going to. You are going to have those hard seasons in marriage, and I want you to expect them so that you're not surprised. But at the same time, I want you to know you can get to the other side. You can fall out of love and you can fall back in love. But it takes God working in your heart. So I want to leave you with two things today. First, Romans 12, 9 and 10 says this. It says, let love be genuine. So as you make these $1 deposits, even though you may not feel love, you can do those, but let it be genuine. Let it come from a genuine heart. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. And it doesn't say outdo one another in showing love or emotion or feelings. It says outdo one another in showing honor. Marshall Siegel on desiringgod.org, he says this. He says, we probably need to be reminded that marriage is less about compatibility than commitment. After all, there has never been a less compatible relationship than a holy God and His sinful bride. And that's the mold we're aiming for in our marriages. It's hard. It's a commitment. If you're going to save money, if you're saving for retirement, it's a commitment, right? You have to give up something to make that investment. In our marriages, we have to give up something to make an investment. But what I'm telling you is you can make a tiny investment and it will add up. It will pay off. But we can't do any of this without God's work in our own heart. So I just want to challenge you this week to think of one thing that you can do, one deposit that you can make into the bank of your relationship as you go this week. Let me pray for us. God, I just thank you for your word. I thank you for the truth of it. God, I thank you for the fact that marriage is painful and wonderful at the same time, God. It's painful to be refined, to become more like you. God, but would you help us see the joy in that? Would you help us see the payoff in that pain, that it's not wasted, that we're never beyond your hand of redemption, God? And so I just pray for each of these women, wherever they are in their marriages today, whether they feel stuck and hopeless. God, you are the God of hope. You are the God of impossible things. You are the God of redemption. God, for the ones who feel like they're just in survival mode, would you just help them recognize that? Give them a heart for their marriage and for their husband. And God, I thank you for the ones who are in a season of thriving right now. God, would you help them to be extra thankful for that? And would you just prepare us for the peaks and the valleys to come, God, knowing that you are steadfast, that you're a rock, that we can always depend on you, God. And would you give us the courage? Would you give us the energy? Would you give us the thought and the conscious effort just to make a $1 deposit into our marriages on a consistent basis, God? We love you in Jesus' name. Amen.